The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 56 Apathy, Distraction, and Emotions at Scale. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Today we're stepping into a quieter kind of crisis. Not the kind that screams or explodes, but the kind that seeps in, slowly, until whole cultures start to move through life half asleep. Numb nations. Because what we're talking about isn't just individual apathy, but emotional anesthesia at scale. We've all felt it. The heavy scrolling, the autopilot binge, the way tragedy turns into background noise because another headline has already replaced it. But when that becomes normal, when distraction becomes our primary medicine, we lose more than just attention. We lose depth, connection, and even the will to act. This episode is about how numbness takes root, how distraction becomes a drug. Apathy isn't laziness, but survival, and what it means when entire societies start to live in that survival mode, not just for days, but for decades. Let's begin. The silence that protects every society carries two stories, the one we see on the surface and the one that hums underneath. On the surface, life looks busy, the scrolling, the streaming, the constant motion of news feeds. But underneath, a quieter story is unfolding. Exhaustion, detachment, silence. In My Inner Child Was Broken, I described how children in unsafe environments sometimes survive by switching off. When love feels conditional or punishment inevitable, the nervous system whispers, "Don't feel, it's safer that way." That's not healing, it's anesthesia. The same adaptation is alive in nations. In the Inversiverse, I explored how perception can be engineered, how repetition, spectacle, and distraction guide entire populations into numbness. The child who numbs to survive grows in the adult who numbs to cope, and together they form societies where apathy isn't an accident, it's cultivated. This is where our story begins, numbness not as laziness or weakness, but as survival at scale. Themes numbness as a protective reflex. For the child, numbness shields against the chaos of neglect or punishment. For the adult, it surfaces in behaviors that look passive but are protective, withdrawing, silencing the self, or scrolling into the night. At the cultural level, it shields nations from the unbearable churn of crisis. What begins as a reflex becomes identity. Distraction as anesthesia. Modern culture runs on anesthetics. The dopamine economy feeds us novelty as if it were medicine, endless entertainment, constant notifications, and breaking news. Like morphine for a wound that never closes, distraction soothes pain while ensuring it remains unresolved. Indifference as engineered survival indifference is cultivated. When populations are exhausted by constant crises, outrage is replaced by memes and protest is replaced by shrugs. Power doesn't need citizens to believe. It only needs them to be too numb to resist. Attribute silence that conceals weight. Beneath stillness lies grief, fear, and anger too heavy to voice. Survival through shutdown. Freeze is intelligence, not weakness. Indifference as exhaustion, not absence of care, but collapse after caring too much, too long. The paradox of numbness. Numbness looks empty, but is overflowing with the national disconnect. What happens when nations go numb? Not in one explosive collapse, but through a slow erosion until detachment becomes the default. The child who survived by shutting down becomes the adult who numbs with distraction. Multiply that by millions, and you get a society where tragedy is consumed and forgotten, outrage is recycled into memes, and grief dissolves into background noise. And here lies the truth. Numbness is one of the most effective tools of control. A loyal population might rebel. A numb one shrugs and moves on, yet numbness isn't empty. It's dense, compressed with everything that couldn't be felt in real time. It whispers through individuals, through groups, through nations. I felt too much, too fast. Personal reflection. I know numbness from the inside. As a child, it was my armor. I recall moments when I would go blank to avoid punishment, with no anger, no tears, just silence. That silence protected me, but it also disconnected me from myself. Later, I found the same pattern in adulthood. Long nights scrolling on my phone, not searching for answers, but hiding from feelings I didn't want to face, a hollow comfort in detachment. And I've seen it mirrored in others. Friends who look away when another crisis fills the news cycle. Colleagues who shrug off injustice with, "That's just the way it is." Not because they don't care, but because caring feels too heavy, when you're already carrying your own private burdens. That's the paradox. Numbness looks like not caring, but it's often the residue of having cared too much. Psychological insight psychology frames numbness as part of the freeze response. When neither fight nor flight are possible, the body collapses into shutdown. Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness showed how repeated exposure to stress without escape conditions people to stop trying. It is not a choice, but to collapse a survival reflex when the system is overwhelmed. I lived this as a child, going blank in the face of punishment, not from calm, but from paralysis. Later, I saw it in myself again, the reflex to scroll, to detach, to stay safe in numbness rather than open the door to grief or anger. Groups experience the same thing. Compassion fatigue is the name given when doctors, nurses, or therapists face endless suffering. At first, they overflow with empathy, but years of overload dry up the well. Their tone flattens, their faces harden. It isn't that they no longer care, it's that they cannot keep caring at that intensity without breaking. At the societal level, numbness becomes systemic. Political psychology has shown that crisis overload leads to collective helplessness. When people are battered by relentless waves of trauma, wars, pandemics, and economic uncertainty, their nervous systems collectively buckle. The protest becomes silent, outrage becomes apathy. Not because people don't care, but because they've been conditioned to believe nothing will change. This is the pattern echoed across scales: the child, the group, the nation. Numbness is never absent, it is an adaptation. It disguises the truth that too much has already been felt. Embodiment prompt or practice pause here. Place your hand on your chest. Take a breath. Ask, what am I avoiding feeling right now? Don't force an answer. Notice what rises. Notice too the urge to escape the question. Both are data. Both deserve compassion. Insight prompt. Where in your life has numbness been your shield, not because you didn't care, but because caring felt impossible to sustain? Integration moment numbness is not a failure, it is survival. At the individual level, it shields the nervous system. At the group level, it keeps the collective from collapsing. At the societal level, it functions as an anesthetic against relentless crisis. But numbness carries a cost. When we stop feeling, we also stop imagining, connecting, resisting. Recognizing numbness not as weakness, but as information is the first step toward reclaiming that capacity. Seed to plant numbness isn't emptiness. It is fullness disguised as stillness. Beneath it lies everything too heavy to be carried at once, waiting for the moment you are ready to feel again. The anesthetics of distraction. If the silence that protects showed how numbness begins as survival, the anesthetics of distraction explores what happens when that survival mode becomes the cultural baseline. We live in an age of engineered anesthesia. Our nervous systems, once attuned to natural cycles of activity and rest, are now overstimulated by the cycles of algorithms and crises. Headlines refresh faster than our emotions can settle. The scroll and the binge are not leisure but medicine, prescribed daily by the dopamine economy. Here we ask, how does distraction become our drug? What does a society addicted to it lose? And why is anesthetized apathy so politically convenient? Theme's emotional shutdown at scale numbness is protective for the individual, but multiplied across millions, it becomes cultural detachment. Nations begin to echo the child in freeze mode, silent, disengaged, pretending not to feel because feeling feels impossible. The dopamine economy. Every ping, notification, and refresh is engineered to deliver a microdose of dopamine. Over time, this hijacking flattens our emotional baseline. Outrage becomes fleeting, joy becomes muted. Everything collapses into the shrug of indifference. The politics of numbness. Power doesn't always require loyalty. Sometimes exhaustion is enough. When outrage dissipates into memes and tragedy is consumed like entertainment, resistance evaporates. The distracted population becomes the pacified one. Attributes engineered for getting. Crises churn so quickly that the last one is erased before it can sink in. Flat effect culture, feelings compressed into emojis, reactions shrunk to clicks. Safe distance illusion, we consume tragedy from afar, convinced we're informed while remaining untouched. Overload as pacification, noise becomes the new silence, drowning resistance in distraction. The void of numbness. We all know numbness personally, the moment you hit your limit and shut down. But scaled to millions, the shutdown takes on a different shape. Think about the last few years: pandemic, wars, economic collapse, climate crisis. Each of these would have defined an era. Now they define a week. Before grief can settle, the next catastrophe demands attention. It's no wonder silence becomes our default. The dopamine economy feeds this cycle. Scroll, refresh, binge, repeat. Not because we're seeking meaning, but because we're seeking escape. We laugh at memes while tragedy smolders beneath them. Entertainment becomes anesthesia, and for those in power, this works perfectly. Control no longer requires censorship, it requires saturation. A population that is overstimulated, flattened, and distracted poses little threat. Personal reflection: I felt this in my own life. During burnout, distraction was my drug of choice. I could lose hours to scrolling, not because I cared about what I was seeing, but because it was easier than facing what I felt. I've watched others move the same way. A friend reading about another war size, yeah, it's bad, before turning back to their feed. That wasn't indifference, it was depletion. They had no emotional bandwidth left to give. Our numbness isn't about not caring, it's about survival. But at the scale of nations, survival looks like silence. Psychological insight: the science of distraction helps explain why silence spreads. At the individual level, the concept of ego depletion shows that willpower and emotional capacity are finite. Once drained, avoidance becomes the nervous system's default. I've lived this, collapsing into distraction at night because my energy to feel had already been spent. At the group level, social contagion demonstrates how emotions spread through networks. Just as fear or joy ripple through crowds, so does apathy. When one person detaches, the group begins to normalize detachment. It's not just personal, it's contagious. At the societal level, Noam Chomsky's theory of manufactured consent reminds us that power doesn't need to silence people if it can flood them. The endless churn of information becomes its own anesthetic. Populations don't resist not because they don't see, but because they can't keep feeling at this intensity. Put together, the message is clear. Distraction isn't neutral. It is the architecture of collective numbness. Embodiment prompt or practice: try this. Switch everything off: no phone, no sound, no stimulation for 60 seconds. Just notice the silence. Where does your mind reach for stimulation? Where does your body resist stillness? This isn't about forcing presence, but about recognizing the reflex to escape, the one our culture has trained into us. Insight prompt: think of the last time you scrolled past something painful: a war, a disaster, someone's grief. Did you feel indifferent, or did you feel too exhausted to let it in? What does that difference reveal about your relationship with numbness? Integration moment at scale: distraction functions as medicine. But medicine taken too long becomes poison. When we anesthetize ourselves daily, we lose not just connection to the world, but connection to our own depth. To integrate, we don't need to cut off every distraction. We need to notice when it stops being a choice and becomes a reflex that tells us we've reached emotional overload. Seed to plant distraction doesn't always escape. Sometimes it's a signal. The question is not, how do I stop distracting myself? But, what am I avoiding that feels too heavy to face? When caring becomes too heavy, the story of numbness isn't just cultural or political, it's deeply personal. It's the quiet undertow in our daily lives, shaping our choices, our relationships, and even how we show up for the people we love. For many of us, numbness doesn't come first. What comes first is caring, often too much. We pour ourselves into people, causes, or responsibilities until the weight becomes unsustainable. And when there's nothing left to give, numbness steps in, not as laziness or coldness, but as protection. This part is about what happens when caring becomes too heavy and numbness becomes the only way to survive the overload. Themes: numbness as armor. What begins as a childhood shield often resurfaces in adulthood. We learn to silence our feelings in the face of chaos, and later we repeat the same reflex, going quiet in conflict, retreating from intimacy, choosing avoidance over confrontation. Armor that once kept us safe becomes a default setting. The exhaustion of overcaring numbness is rarely the first response. It usually follows periods of intensity, heartbreak, burnout, and emotional labor. The nervous system shuts down not because it doesn't care, but because it has pushed itself past its limits. Disguised indifference. From the outside, numbness can look like apathy. A partner who doesn't respond, a colleague who shrugs, a friend who scrolls past tragedy. But beneath that mask is saturation, not emptiness. What looks like not caring is often the residue of caring too much. Attributes armor of silence, a defense mechanism repurposed into adulthood. Emotional overdraft, collapse after long periods of overinvestment. False indifference, detachment that hides depletion rather than absence. Habitual disconnection, numbness practiced so often it becomes identity. Personal reflection. I remember seasons in my life where I was anything but indifferent. I cared so much it consumed me, relationship causes people I wanted to rescue. I carried more than was mine to hold. And when the weight became unbearable, I didn't explode. I shut down. There were times I stopped answering calls, not because I didn't love the people reaching out, but because I had no capacity left to give. Times I sat in a room with someone in pain, and instead of rushing to comfort them, I felt myself retreat, not out of coldness, but out of depletion. From the outside, it probably looked like I didn't care. On the inside, it was the opposite. I had cared myself empty. That's the trap of numbness. It disguises itself as indifference when often it is the residue of love, concern, and overextension. Psychological insight psychologists call this emotional exhaustion, one of the hallmarks of burnout. Christina Maslach's research shows that when emotional labor becomes chronic, people slip into depersonalization, treating themselves or others as objects to conserve energy. At the individual level, this might mean withdrawing from a partner, staying silent in arguments, not because love is gone, but because the capacity to feel is spent. At the group level, it shows up in workplaces and families. A team under relentless pressure begins to lose empathy for one another. Sarcasm replaces warmth, efficiency replaces care. The group isn't heartless, it's exhausted. At the societal level, it manifests as compassion fatigue on a massive scale. Entire populations watch tragedy after tragedy until the collective response becomes a shrug. This doesn't mean people don't care. It means they've carried too much without relief. Across these levels, numbness is not the opposite of caring. It is the scar tissue of caring beyond capacity. Embodiment prompt or practice. Take a slow breath. Think of a time when you felt yourself shut down after giving too much. Place your hand on your stomach and ask, what weight was I carrying that made silence feel safer than expression? Notice what arises, maybe not words, but sensations. Let your body answer in its own language. Insight prompt. Can you recall a moment when someone mistook your numbness for not caring, when in truth you were simply at your limit? What would you have wanted them to understand about you in that moment? Integration moment numbness doesn't mean the end of care. It means care has reached its breaking point. When we mistake numbness for indifference, we misread its purpose. Numbness is protection, not absence. The work is not to reject numbness, but to recognize it as a signal of how much we've given, how much we've carried, and where our healing needs to begin. Seed to plant numbness is not the death of care. It is the residue of care overflowing. To meet it gently is to rediscover the tenderness beneath it, the architecture of collective numbness. We've seen how numbness starts as personal armor and how it disguises itself as indifference when caring becomes too heavy. But numbness doesn't stop at the individual. When multiplied across groups and societies, it becomes systemic. This part explores the architecture of collective numbness, how trauma responses scale up, how emotions spread through networks, and how power structures exploit exhaustion to maintain control. Themes trauma echoed in culture. What individuals experience in their nervous systems, fight, flight, freeze, echoes at the collective level. Nations mirror trauma responses. When crises keep coming and no escape seems possible, whole societies slip into a collective freeze. Emotional contagion research in social psychology shows that emotions spread through groups like viruses. Joy, fear, rage, and apathy. One person's detachment becomes contagious. Groups mirror each other's shutdowns, creating cultural norms of disengagement. Power and overload isn't just a side effect of modern life, it's a tool. Saturating populations with crises, information, and distraction creates learned helplessness at scale. This is where numbness becomes most dangerous, not only as protection, but as a design. Attributes collective freeze, nations locked in the same paralysis as traumatized individuals. Contagious apathy, disengagement spreading like wildfire through groups. Overstimulation as control, power maintained by flooding rather than silencing. Helplessness as policy, systems sustained by populations too numb to resist. The echoing loop of collective numbness. The patterns of trauma don't stop at the body, they echo outward. At the level of nations, you can see the collective freeze. Endless crises, wars, pandemics, and ecological disasters batter the population until paralysis feels safer than engagement. Outrage burns bright for a moment, then fizzles. Not because the issues are resolved, but because the people are already exhausted. In groups, the same thing happens. Emotional contagion makes apathy spread. In families, in workplaces, in communities, one person's withdrawal can normalize silence. Soon, no one speaks. The group protects itself through detachment. And at the societal level, this paralysis is convenient. Saturation functions as control. Censorship isn't always necessary when distraction will do. If people are too overwhelmed to care, power goes unchallenged. Collective numbness isn't a glitch in the system. It is often the system's most stable feature, personal reflection. I remember a point during the pandemic where the weight of constant news cycles became unbearable. At first, every headline hit me hard, fear, anger, grief all flaring at once. I'd call friends, we'd debate, sometimes rage together at the absurdity of how things were handled. But as weeks turned into months, and then years, something shifted. The outrage dulled. Our conversations became shorter, punctuated with shrugs or jokes. It wasn't that we stopped caring. It was that we couldn't keep caring at that intensity without breaking. I saw this play out again during other global crises. I'd scroll through images of bombed out cities or wildfires tearing through forests and feel the familiar surge of grief, only to find myself moving on within minutes. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to hold it anymore. It was like my system had developed a reflex. Take it in just enough to acknowledge it, then shut it down before it overwhelms you. And I wasn't alone. Friends who used to be fiery in their activism grew quieter. Colleagues who once spoke up in meetings started shrugging off injustice with, "What's the point?" What I realized in those moments was that my personal numbness wasn't isolated. It was braided into a larger silence, one shared by the people around me. My shutdown wasn't just mine, it was collective. Psychological insight. At the individual level, trauma theory shows us the freeze response as the last resort of the nervous system. When fight or flight are impossible, collapse becomes the only way to endure. At the group level, research into emotional contagion by scholars like Elaine Hatfield demonstrates how moods and affects spread unconsciously in social networks. When exhaustion becomes the group's dominant tone, disengagement becomes the norm. At the societal level, Noam Chomsky's concept of manufactured consent and Neil Postman's critique in Amusing Ourselves to Death reveal how distraction and overload can pacify populations more effectively than censorship. By flooding the senses, societies are numbed into compliance. Taken together, these insights show that numbness is not just personal psychology, but collective architecture. It scales from the nervous system to the nation, until silence itself becomes policy. Embodiment, prompt, or practice. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture a recent crisis you saw in the news. Notice what you felt in that first instant: fear, anger, grief. Then notice what happened after. Did the feeling fade into silence, into avoidance, into numbness? Breathe into that shift. Recognize it not as failure, but as evidence of how your body protects itself, the same way societies protect themselves. Insight prompt. Think of a time when you felt part of a larger wave of numbness, when friends, colleagues, or whole communities seemed to disengage at once. What did that collective silence do to your own ability to feel or act? Integration moment numbness at scale is not weakness, it is survival. But when silence becomes the cultural norm, we lose more than comfort. We lose the very capacity for change. Integration here means recognizing numbness not just in ourselves, but in our groups and cultures, to see it for what it is, a mirror of trauma, a contagion of exhaustion, and often a system's most subtle weapon. Seed to plant collective numbness is not proof of apathy, but proof of saturation. Beneath the silence lies the possibility of awakening if we can learn to notice where our culture has gone still and choose to feel again. Weaponizing silence numbness begins as survival, but once it spreads across societies, it can be shaped, manipulated, and exploited. In this part, we turn to the darker truth. Silence is not only a byproduct of exhaustion, it can also be engineered into a weapon. Governments, corporations, and institutions have long recognized that a disengaged, anesthetized population is easier to manage than an enraged one, and so systems evolve not to eliminate numbness, but to amplify it. Themes overload as strategy. When too much information floods in at once, the capacity to respond collapses. Noise itself becomes the tool of pacification. We mistake saturation for awareness, but in reality we are paralyzed. Spectacle as sedation, politics, media, and culture often deliver reality as performance. Tragedy and crisis are packaged as spectacle. We watch, we scroll, we react, but we do not act. The stage show distracts from the deeper wound. Silence as compliance. A silent population isn't necessarily content, it's exhausted. Yet silence is easily misinterpreted as consent. Power thrives when numbness dulls resistance, when inaction is mistaken for agreement. Attributes expanded, saturation tactic, crises piled on crises until meaning is drowned. Performance politics. Outrage manufactured and dissipated as entertainment. Consent illusion, absence of protest framed as acceptance. Pacified populations, systems sustained by exhaustion rather than loyalty. Silence is not indifference. Look closely at how modern systems operate. A new scandal breaks, and within hours another one arrives. The flood leaves us gasping. Before we've processed one outrage, three more demand our attention. Soon we stop trying. Silence is not indifference, it is survival. But to the system, that silence looks like stability. Spectacle compounds the effect. Politicians argue in sound bites, celebrities weigh in, hashtags trend. Outrage rises and falls like fireworks, but fireworks don't illuminate for long, they dazzle, then fade. The cycle of performance sedates us more effectively than censorship ever could, and so silence, exhaustion, and detachment all are reinterpreted by those in power as compliance. In reality, it's collapsing, but collapse is convenient. A society too numb to resist becomes the easiest society to govern. Personal reflection. For me, numbness hasn't come from being afraid to speak. I've spoken, loudly, consistently, sometimes relentlessly. But the numbness sets in when those words fall flat, when they're dismissed or ignored. I've felt it most when pointing out the fractures in our world, the corruption, the manipulation, the way systems condition us to comply. I would bring it up in conversations, write about it, share it, only to watch people brush it off with a joke or change the subject. That lack of recognition cuts deeper than disagreement. It tells you your words have no weight. After enough of those moments, a kind of emotional fatigue sets in. You still see what's happening, you still feel it, but you stop expecting others to join you there. The silence that follows isn't because you don't care, it's because caring alone feels unbearable. That's what numbness has meant for me. Not the absence of a voice, but the slow erosion of faith that anyone is listening. Psychological insight. At the individual level, psychologist Albert Bandura wrote about moral disengagement, the process by which people distance themselves from responsibility when overwhelmed or pressured. It isn't that morality vanishes, it becomes muted by circumstance. At the group level, Stanley Cohen's concept of states of denial shows how communities collectively ignore what feels unbearable to confront. People know, but they act as if they don't. The denial is social, not individual. At the societal level, thinkers like Guy Debord, the Society of the Spectacle, argued that modern life itself becomes performance, where spectacle replaces reality and distracts us from action. In this theatre, numbness isn't accidental, it's cultivated. These theories converge on a single point. Silence, once survival, becomes usable. Systems need not erase dissent if they can engineer numbness to the point where dissent feels impossible. Embodiment prompt or practice pause. Think of one issue in the world that weighs on you but feels too overwhelming to act on. Notice what happens in your body when you bring it to mind. Do you feel tension, collapse, the urge to look away? Instead of forcing action, just notice the reflex. This awareness is the first step in recognizing how systems exploit our thresholds. Insight prompt. When have you mistaken your own silence for not caring, when in truth it was fatigue? And how might that silence have been misinterpreted by others as consent or indifference? Integration moment silence at scale is survival, but it is also vulnerability. When populations go quiet, systems face less resistance, not because they are trusted, but because they have succeeded in exhausting the voices that might oppose them. The integration is this. Numbness is not only a signal of what we've carried, it is also the terrain where power takes root. To see numbness clearly is to recognize where systems have weaponized our survival reflex. Seed to plant your silence is not your consent, but unless you reclaim it, others will use it as if it were. Cracks in the silence, once it spreads across a population, seems impenetrable. Exhaustion hardens into apathy, and apathy into routine. But silence is never total. Even in the deepest numbness, small ruptures appear. A moment of honesty, a surge of grief, a story that slips through the cracks. These become reminders that the anesthesia isn't absolute. This part explores how numbness begins to fracture, through relationships, through moments of crisis, through the stubborn persistence of human feeling. Themes emotional spillover. Even when we numb ourselves, emotions don't disappear. They seep out sideways, in anger at small things, in tears at unexpected moments, in the body carrying what the mind suppresses. These cracks reveal the weight beneath. Disruption and recognition. Numbness often breaks when someone recognizes what we've been carrying. To feel seen is to feel again. Recognition interrupts silence. The return of feeling, reawakening rarely comes as a flood. It arrives as flickers. A book, a conversation, a piece of art, a sudden laugh. The smallest spark can remind us that beneath numbness lies not emptiness, but life waiting to return. Attributes leakage of the unfelt, emotions seeping through despite suppression. Shock of recognition, moments where being seen reopens what was hidden. Fragile sparks, brief, often surprising returns of feeling. Resilient undercurrent, proof that numbness is a lid, not an erasure. Silence that tells a story numbness pretends to be final, the end of feeling. But the truth is, it never fully works. The body leaks what the mind tries to bury. The grief we think we've swallowed re-emerges in sudden irritability. The fear we've numbed resurfaces in restless nights. Even silence tells a story if you listen closely. Sometimes the crack comes through recognition. A friend names aloud what we thought no one noticed, and suddenly the weight feels lighter. For me, numbness often dissolved the moment someone truly acknowledged what I was saying, not dismissing, not deflecting, just recognizing it as real. That act alone was enough to restore a pulse to what I'd buried. And sometimes the fracture comes in quieter ways. A song that pierces, a memory that surfaces, a burst of laughter we didn't expect. These fragile sparks are reminders. Numbness is not emptiness. It is life pressed down, waiting for release. Personal reflection. The cracks in my own silence have rarely been dramatic. They've come in subtle, almost ordinary ways. I remember one conversation where, after years of feeling unheard, someone finally looked me in the eye and said, "I see it too." Just 4 words, but they were enough. The numbness I'd been carrying cracked, and beneath it was relief, not that the world had changed, but that I wasn't carrying it alone. Other times it was art that broke through. A film, a lyric, even an offhand line in a book that said out loud what I had been living quietly. Recognition, even from a stranger across time, shattered the illusion that silence was all there was. These moments taught me that numbness doesn't erase our capacity to feel. It only waits for recognition, for resonance, for something that reminds us. You are not alone in this wait. Psychological insight psychology recognizes that numbness is rarely absolute. At the individual level, trauma research shows how suppressed emotions resurface in what Bessel van der Kolk called the body keeping the score. Numbness might muffle feelings, but the body leaks them through symptoms, behaviors, and sudden emotional bursts. At the group level, James Pennebaker's work on collective trauma narratives suggests that healing begins when groups find words for what was silenced. Storytelling itself becomes a crack in the collective silence. At the societal level, history is full of moments where silence seemed total until recognition shattered it. Civil rights movements, uprisings, and cultural shifts often began not with massive revolutions, but with small ruptures, a story that caught fire, an image that people could no longer ignore. These insights confirm what lived experience already knows. Numbness is not erasure, it is containment, and containment by nature is fragile. Embodiment prompt or practice close your eyes. Recall a moment when someone recognized a truth you'd been carrying in silence. Where in your body did you feel the relief? Where do you feel it now as you recall it? Let that recognition soften the weight of numbness, even briefly. Insight prompt. Think of a time when numbness cracked through recognition, art, or unexpected emotion. What did that moment reveal to you about what was still alive beneath the silence? Integration moment. The cracks matter. They remind us that numbness is never total, that silence is never absolute. Beneath the freeze is life, waiting for recognition, for resonance, for release. Integration means noticing these ruptures not as interruptions, but as proof. Feeling still lives here. It has not been erased, only contained. See to plant numbness is a lid, not an ending. Every crack in the silence is proof that life is still moving beneath. The work of feeling again, numbness cracks, but cracks alone aren't enough. If we ignore them, they seal over. If we attend to them, they become open pathways back to feeling, back to connection, back to life. The work of feeling again is about the slow, deliberate work of feeling again, not drowning ourselves in everything at once, but relearning how to carry what once felt unbearable. Themes reclaiming sensitivity. Numbness dulls the senses, healing sharpens them again. Reclaiming sensitivity means allowing space for smaller, safer feelings to return first, noticing the subtleties before confronting the overwhelm. Building recognition. We heal through being seen. Whether in one-on-one conversations, communities, or collective storytelling, recognition is the antidote to silence. To be named is to be reawakened. Practicing emotional capacity. Feeling again is like rebuilding a muscle. It happens slowly through intentional practices, grounding, embodiment, storytelling, creativity. Each moment of safe feeling expands the nervous system's capacity. Attributes gentle exposure, returning to feeling in manageable doses. Shared witnessing, healing through recognition and resonance. Embodied practice, using the body as a guide for re-entry. Incremental strength, emotional capacity grows like a muscle, rep after rep. Reopening, from numbness to feeling, the work of feeling again is not heroic. It is ordinary. It's the decision to let a small crack become a doorway. For me, it has often meant starting small, noticing when a song moves me, letting the tears come without forcing them back, letting myself sit with grief or anger for just a moment longer than feels comfortable. Writing words I wasn't sure anyone would read, but writing them anyway, because the act itself restored meaning. What makes the difference is recognition. A single moment of being seen can transform silence into connection. Each time someone has said to me, "I feel that too," it has been a reminder. Numbness is not permanent. Feeling returns in the presence of a witness. And over time, this work accumulates. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. What once felt impossible becomes a part of living. The work of feeling again is not about never going numb. It's about knowing how to find the cracks and choosing to step through them. Personal reflection. I've noticed that the more I allow myself to speak what feels heavy, even when I'm unsure it will be heard, the lighter it becomes. Not because the world changes instantly, but because my body does. Moments where someone echoed back my own truth, where I didn't feel alone in carrying it, have been some of the most powerful antidotes to numbness. I've learned that recognition doesn't erase the weight, but it redistributes it. It becomes bearable. The numbness loosens each time I let myself feel in small, deliberate ways, listening to music without distraction, sitting with silence, or writing from the heart. These moments have reminded me numbness is not forever. It can be undone piece by piece. Psychological insight. At the individual level, therapies like somatic experiencing, Peter Levine, show that trauma recovery isn't about reliving everything at once. It's about titration, reintroducing feeling in small doses the body can handle. At the group level, Narrative psychology and Pennebaker's research on expressive writing highlight the healing power of storytelling. When groups share stories of what was silenced, the cracks widen and collective numbness begins to soften. At the societal level, history shows that recognition spreads. A single story, a testimony, a song, an image can reawaken empathy across millions. The work of feeling again is not only individual healing, but cultural resensitization. Together, these insights affirm that numbness is reversible. It takes patience, recognition, and practice. But cracks can become openings, and openings can become paths. Embodiment prompt practice: choose one small feeling today to let in. Maybe it's the sadness in a song, the warmth of a memory, the frustration of a minor inconvenience. Don't rush to numb it, don't judge it. Just let it live in your body for a moment longer than usual. Notice what happens. Insight prompt: where have you already noticed a crack in your own numbness? What practice, person, or moment has reminded you that feeling is still alive beneath the surface? Integration moment: the work of feeling again doesn't demand perfection. You don't need to feel everything all at once. You just need to let something in. Bit by bit, the body remembers. Bit by bit, numbness loosens. Integration means recognizing that numbness isn't failure, it's fatigue. And fatigue can recover. Feeling returns in the small choices we make to notice, to express, to connect. Seed to plant feeling is not gone. It is waiting. Every crack in the silence is an invitation to return. Returning from numbness at scale is survival, but it is also a trap. It protects us from what feels unbearable, but it also keeps us from living fully, from resisting, from connecting. In this episode, we've walked through its layers: the silence that protects, the anesthetics of distraction, the weight of overcaring, the architecture of collective numbness, the weaponization of silence, and finally, the cracks that remind us life is still moving underneath. The invitation is simple, but not easy. Notice where numbness lives in you and trust that it isn't forever. Beneath it, your capacity to feel is waiting. Beneath it, your capacity to act is waiting. Beneath it, your humanity is waiting. We are not empty. We are full, full of feelings that have been carried too long, waiting for the cracks where light can return. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. And as always, stay unfiltered, stay human, and keep walking the fringe. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse: a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 the simulated self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 the spell of the mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 conscious seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 the myth of sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 the algorithmic mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 the noise of knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 belief machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19. The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20. Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.